spider ball. Basically what I did with procedural texturing is I textured this entire thing, and I used a single generic scratch map from the internet to do all of this. Like there's only one file texture in here, and it's not even a nice file texture. So procedural texturing goes through and basically calculates a bunch of different stuff based on the properties of your object, and how you cleverly link together nodes to create really pretty cool effects with it. And the really nice thing about procedural texturing, so I took that exact same texture and I threw it on my face, and it gives you, you can see it's still looks like a pretty much fully textured object. It has like rust under here, so it'll basically tailor itself to whatever object that you apply it to. So it's really powerful for quickly creating a bunch of similar assets with like the same basic texture to them, or if you wanted to like add wear to a bunch of stuff. And you can actually bake these out into maps, which I will go over probably next week. Mostly I want to figure out how to optimize the render time, because I tried it and it took like 5 minutes, then I gave up. But you can export these out if you wanted to, so like texture your stuff in Maya procedurally and then export the map, and you can have, you know, pre-made game asset textures. And then for your assignment this week, I made this snarky little shaderbot robot. I'll go over him more later, but here's just the texture applied to a snarky little robot guy. So, yeah. And you can use this guy for your homework assignment if you want to like do your own stuff with him. You'll have to repose him. But anywho. So, are there any questions on what procedural texturing is? It'll probably get like really obvious in 10 seconds, but any just like preliminary questions? All right. So I have this base scene set up, and I basically just have a bunch of different pre-made, just sort of crappy textures that I've done. And I'm going to use all of these to more or less recreate that shader that I just showed you. Hideous rust texture. So if you guys weren't crazy familiar with the outliner or the Hypershade before today, you will be after today, or whenever you do your actual assignment. So just like really quick, if you pull up your Hypershade, again, that's this little blue bubble up here. You can also find it in Windows Rendering Editor's Hypershade. I've gone over a little bit of this stuff before. So like it'll give you a list of all your materials, all your different textures, utilities, all that stuff. I should totally delete some of this extra stuff. But we're going to be working a lot in the node editor today, this little section down here. So I'm going to show you guys how to navigate in that a little bit more. If you need to just like, oh god, this is my shader tree for something I made. So if you guys just need to navigate around, scroll wheel actually works in this, which is nice. And then you can just pan back and forth the same way you do in Maya, which is Alt, middle mouse button, drag. That's pretty much how you navigate this. And you'll notice right now, for some reason, I just have like a bajillion and one nodes open up. If I wanted to get rid of some of these and just sort of like clean up the space I was looking at, like I don't need to see all of these guys here. You can just select these, and there's a bunch of little buttons that are like square buttons with sort of blue teal icons on them. If I just hit the little one with a minus at the top, it's going to just remove those from my view down here. It's not deleting them, it's just saying, hey, I don't need to see this in this window. If you do actually select this node and like delete it, it is going to permanently delete that texture, unless you undo it. So don't accidentally hit delete, which I do all of the time, because that will totally get rid of your stuff. So you can marquee select a bunch of things and hide all of them if you want. If there's a particular thing that you want to look at, say there's dust texture, I'll just select that and hit this little plus button. It's going to add that into my view. And then I can just also clean all of this stuff out if I just want all of this gone. This little square with the three sort of blue sparkle symbols, we'll just get rid of everything. So if you have a texture down there, so I'm just going to grab my dust and add it in. When you're looking at this, you can expand and collapse these little nodes here. So there's a little hamburger menu at the top, which you can use to do that, which is usually what I do. You can also, if you toggle between, with your nodes selected, you can toggle between 1, 2, 3, what are we doing? 1, 2, 3, and 0. Oh, that's not a 0, it's a tilde. Sorry, wait, oh, my bad. So you can toggle between 1, 2, 3, and 4 on your keyboard, and that'll just expand and collapse them to the different levels. If that happens to be easier for you, again, I usually just use the little burger menu because I'm lazy. So that's pretty much that. Any questions on just like navigating around down here? All right. So the first thing I'm going to show you guys is procedural texturing. I'll show you some of the stuff in Arnold, and then I'll show you like a few of the same things in Redshift. But basically the idea for this first thing, I'm going to say I want to create some kind of look of scratched metal. So imagine like car paint with some scratches taken out of it. And it more or less functions, so like procedural texturing is going to use these base colors and treat them a little bit like just layers in Photoshop where you put a mask on one of them and it shows the material beneath it. So if you're working with Arnold, you're going to look for a mix node. So to pull up this little bar, you just put your cursor anywhere in here and hit tab. It's going to pull up this little searchy bar thing. And I'm going to find this AI mix shader. It'll pop that little thing up. And you can see that it gives you an input for 2 shaders and a mix weight. So I'm going to throw in my, wait, let me adjust my view slightly. All right, perfect. All right, so I'm going to take this mix shader and just throw that onto my object, and I'm just middle mouse button and dragging that straight onto my object. And I'm also going to go through and label this. So I will say this probably like 30 times today, but when you're doing procedural texturing, it's super important that you label your stuff or else you are going to get so confused what you're doing. So usually if it's a mix node, it's my personal preference, I'll label it mix. And then just something logical about what that mix is doing. And you'll notice that my object is black right now, basically because I have not input anything into this. So if I drag in car paint, and I drag in my chrome, you can see that it's giving me kind of something arbitrary that's like sort of, it's like not quite chrome and not quite blue. If I toggle the mix weight back and forth, so 0 is going to show this shader 1, which is chrome, and 1 is going to show shader 2, which is car paint. So the same way that I, like, when we went over transmission, like adding a sticker on glass, if you map this mix weight, I'm just going to throw on a checker texture, you can see that, this is my non-UV'd object, you can see that it's basically toggling between the 2 objects. So this is like, I mean, hopefully you guys are like excited about this by now, but like, this saves you so much time because I can really easily switch out from like, cool, I don't want this blue car paint. It turns out that I actually want rust instead of car paint. So I'll just take my rust texture, drag it over my car paint, and it immediately replaces everything. Which, in my opinion, is way nicer than having to go into Photoshop and create separate maps for like all the roughness, shininess, metalness between these 2 different materials. You literally just swap out base materials. So it's a fairly modular way of doing stuff. You can have, use the same chrome material for multiple different textures and multiple different objects without needing to spend a bajillion years doing Photoshop stuff. I'm a little prejudiced against Photoshop. I'm actually really quick going to swap this out for my UV object because it'll look a little bit nicer. I have far too many tabs open. Wow. Cool. All right. What am I now? All right. So here's my UV object. UVs look a little weird, but it's still kind of better. So if you still do need to UV your objects before you do your procedural texturing. Otherwise, you can get, especially if you're going to use file texture somewhere in here, you'll get stretching. I had a lot of stretching on down here previously, which is why I UV'd my ball. But anywho. So as a more kind of maybe functional or interesting example of what you can do with just like a really basic mix weight map, I could go in there, I'm going to replace this with a rust with blue metal. So if you make a ramp shader, so I'm just going to, go to my mix weight, throw in just like this basic little ramp thing. I use these for kind of everything. It's a little ridiculous, but I'm just going to set interpolation to none. So instead of having a fade, it's going to give me a really sharp line. And what you can do, so let me repeat this really quick, maybe 10 times. So again, if you go into the Place 2D texture node with any of your like file textures ramps, it'll basically just automatically tile it here. You can see that now instead of being a single black and white stripe, it's like 10 of them because I tiled it 10 times. But what you can do that's really fun is go in and play with these settings down here. So you can add like waves to your stuff if you want to. You can add, and this is my personal favorite, noise, which is super trippy and just ridiculous looking. You can play with like the noise frequency depending on what you get. But it's kind of fun to just like texture beach balls like this for some reason. I don't know why, I just think it's cool. But it also does create effect similar to, if any of you are familiar with Damascus steel, it's basically just like steel that's been, it's like different types of steel that's been like repeatedly folded upon itself and like hammered out, and it's a whole labor-intensive process to make it, but this is like a Damascus steel blade, and you can see that the texture is fairly similar to this. Mud box open. So you can do some, again, really interesting stuff with this. And then if I, swap the interpolation, it gives me a completely different effect. Yep. Oh, was that? Oh, cool. Thought that was a question. Just move my shader ball. So again, that's just like quickie Damascus steel. So I'm going to go back to my Hypershade again and show you how to actually put on scratches, because that is what I promised. So in this case, fairly straightforward. I'm literally just going to put in a file texture and find my gross. This is the scratch texture I'm using, just like this generic one from the internet. And I'm just going to throw that on there. Make sure you check alpha's luminance, and you can see that it's showing up and making different scratches in my material. In this case, I think it's really low res and looks frankly horrendous. So I'm going to go into my Place 2D texture node and just repeat this maybe 3 times. That feels maybe excessive, whatever. So that's like, again, just sort of like quickie, easy way to do this in Photoshop. Now with procedural texturing. And like imagine again that you were doing this in Photoshop, you would have to go in and make like 6 different maps for this for like metalness, shininess, color, and it took like 2 seconds to set that up, which is why I love procedural texturing. It's great. So any questions on just like the basics of how a mix node works? All right. So in that case, I'm going to just clear out this because I don't want to look at this. And actually that's a terrible idea. All right, I just have this weird random mix shader floating around. All right. So I'm going to make another mix shader, and I'm going to show you guys something a little bit more interesting where it's like a little bit more procedural. So if you look at, I closed it, didn't I? So if you look at like this weird little image that I have here, you might notice that around the edges here, here's my scratch map that I put on, but around the edges you have a little bit of like wear and tear. That's something that Maya generates procedurally based on a certain node. So I'm going to show you guys how to set that up. It's fairly straightforward. So I have my mix shader. Again, I'm just going to I'm going to assign this mix shader to my object and then throw in my material. So in this case, I'm going Chrome and I'm going Car Paint. And I'm going to enable this again. Mix. Cool. So for my mix node this time, instead of using a file texture, I'm going to use, again, a node that comes with Arnold. So if I hit tab to bring up this little search menu, I'm looking for the AI curvature node. So I just type in curve. Usually finds it after like 2 letters. So again, that's the AI curvature node. And I'm going to just grab the out color of this and throw it directly into my mix. And you'll actually notice when I do that, it grays out. It's like, you can't put that there. No. If that ever happens to you, don't freak out. The mix wants a single value, and out color has 3 values, 1 for R, G, and B. So you can pretty much, if it's a black and white map, which this is, you can just pick any of these. It really doesn't matter. And just throw that into the mix, and you can see that now it'll actually accept it. So now that it's hooked up, it's probably not going to be really obvious what this is doing. So if you're in the Arnold render view, they do have this really cool feature, which I'm quite fond of. This little like white bubble with a dotted line around it is isolate select. So if I click on that, whatever I have selected at the time, so like if I select my ground plane, it's only going to render my ground. If I select this edge mix scratches, it's going to render anything with that texture on it. If I select my curvature node, it's going to show me just the curvature node. Which, again, I like using this with procedural texturing, just because it is a little bit easier to see exactly what my map is doing. But you'll notice, so what this is doing is basically going around your object and measuring the curvature of the given faces on your object. Effectively what this does is it highlights the edges of things where there's a sharp curve. So anywhere that it's highlighting right now is more or less a 90-degree angle. So you can see it's the sharper the angle, the brighter the white is. This is a fair, like this, I made this side, it's the same shape, same depth, all that stuff. This one's just, I hardened the edges, and this one I made the edges soft. So here it's like a less intense effect. But that's basically all the curvature node does, is it just goes around and just sort of highlights the edges of your objects based on whatever mathematical value it calculates for the curvature at a given point. So if I look in my settings for this curvature node, you'll notice that there's two different modes for it. There's convex and concave. So convex is going to grab all of the outer edges. This is really good for, again, like that little scratch thing I just showed you in Paint, where it'll, if you need like wear on the outside of an edge. Concave is good if you've ever seen dirt or grime that like gets into a little crevice and you can't get it out. Convex can be a way to get that in there. There's also another way to do that, but I'll show you guys that later. Functionally, you use it the same way for both, so I'll just show you the outer scratches now. But you can also play with like the radius and the spread to get different effects, not all of which are good looking. So it does take a little bit of twiddling, but I'll say maybe something like this isn't the worst thing I've ever seen. So I'll just click on my mix shader again, and you can see that there is a little bit of blue that's sort of showing up around the edges. Now if I'm shooting for like scratched car paint, clearly I've reversed my textures because I'm a dingus. Literally every single time I put these textures in, I do it backwards. Really easy fix, just take your shaders and swish them around. It drives me nuts when I do it, because I do it, sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm doing it right this time, and then I don't. But you can see, so if I switch that, now I have these sort of worn edges around my object. Does this make sense? Cool. So if you happen to be working with your curvature node and like can't quite get the effect that you're looking for, you can add what's called an AI range node. So if you hit tab and then just type in range, again, AI range is what you're shooting for. Basically, it functions a little bit, I find it super awkward to use, but it gives you sliders where you can adjust the, basically clamp these values down for the whites and blacks and get a little bit more refined result, have a little bit more control over what you're doing. So I'm just going to grab the out color from my curvature and throw that into the input of my range, and grab out color R of range and throw it into my mix. So now instead of the curvature being connected to the mix, it's connected to the range, which is then connected to the mix. So if I click on these right now, they look pretty much the same. Once I start playing with these sliders, you can see that I can really like crush down some of these values if I wanted to. In this case, I'm trying to actually make it more intense. So you can see the difference between, like, it's a little subtle this time, but like this versus this is significantly brighter. I could make like really aggressive fine wear on the edges if I want to. Again, I find these kind of counterintuitive, but like if you fiddle with them, you can get a lot more control over what you're actually doing. So in this case, I'm just going to say that this is reasonable. And now we have lovely wear and tear on the outside of our objects. So any questions about how to hook in a range node in there? Yep. Like to make the, like to manually texture it, or? I mean, I prefer procedural texturing. I hate making texture maps. It honestly just depends, I guess, on the workflow that you prefer. If you do need like wear in a really specific area, you probably would want to actually go in and like manually add that in. But if you just sort of want like, imagine you're making like hundreds of background assets for a game and you just sort of need several different metals that are all like the same sort of rusted metal, you could use this to kind of like fudge the textures, so you don't need to manually create hundreds of textures. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
Cool. Any other questions? All right. So me and being spazzy, I'm all about like, oh, let's make things look natural, and I don't know, something about having this like perfect gradient of chrome along the entire edge looks really ridiculous to me. So I'm going to show you really quick how to go through and relatively, this is like even easier in Arnold, or in Redshift, sorry. But I'm going to show you in Arnold how to go in and add a little bit of noise to this. Basically what I'm going to be doing is using an AI multiply node, which if you've ever done like a multiply layer in Photoshop where it just takes anything that's black, it'll just like crush down the stuff under it and turn it black, pretty much does the exact same thing. So I'm just going to I think I actually have a random noise texture floating around. Yes. No, I don't. Okay, that's a bummer. All right, so I'm going to make a noise texture. And so I just typed in noise here because I don't feel like pulling up the little menu. So if I ever say like noise or ramp or like any of the generic stuff I'll map into like a color value or something like that, you are looking for the texture version, not the projection or the stencil texture versions. So I'm just going to make a noise. And I'm just going to temporarily replace the out color of my edge scratches because it's going to be the easiest way to actually see what that noise is doing. Why are you doing this? There we go. So you can see, I'm just going to scroll out really quick. Basically, this is how it's affecting my object, which I think looks ridiculous. So the first thing I'm going to do is just go through and grab my noise texture, and just go into the Place 2D texture node and repeat the crap out of this thing. If you wanted weird zebra stripes, kind of looks like braided rope actually. So I'm gonna say maybe something even like 20. I'm going for like a really fine grain in the textures because I feel like that somehow that makes sense to my brain. But you can see again, this is like affecting the object differently. And I might play with. I think I want like a little bit more dark colors in here. So I might just like, noise textures are so awkward. Arnold actually has their own noise textures. If you guys ever need, it's just like a different way that, it's just like a different function for the noise color. But it behaves like slightly differently. All right, I'm just gonna call that good and say whatever, because oh my, that's a questionable effect. All right, so anywho, so this is like more or less what I got. So now what I'm going to do is actually, like I said, I'm going to basically use a multiply node and combine both of these. So I have the black and white map for my curvature and the black and white of my noise. I'm just going to multiply them together to get a single mix that I can use in here as a alpha. So again, hit tab, type in multiply. And again, we're looking for AI multiply. So any Arnold specific shaders have AI in front of them. Redshift shaders or like Redshift nodes use RS. If you see anything else like pre-multiply, multiply and divide, these are all just built into Maya. And they will work with any rendering engine. You cannot use Redshift nodes in Arnold or vice versa, but again, you can use these Maya nodes in pretty much whatever. So I'm just going to grab my noise texture. And I'm going to grab the whole out color, throw it into input 1, and the out color of my range, and put that into range in input 1, noise in input 2. It really doesn't make a functional difference which layer you put which on, so I just sort of randomly plug them in. So I'm going to grab the out color and just throw that again into my mix node. So you can see by doing that right now, you can see it's like definitely breaking up the scratches and the wear in the side of that object a little bit. So this can be a pretty good way to go in and just like add a little bit of like another layer of control, another layer of detail into your procedural textures. If you ever happen to find, I do this like all the time, where like my texture map will be reversed and I'll, put it in, it ends up turning the whole thing chrome or something crazy. You probably just need to like switch, like anywhere that's white on your noise texture, make it black and vice versa. Most of the time that'll fix the issue. But yeah, so again, you can see you have like pretty nice noise in here. So any questions on how we did this? All right. And if you were so inclined, you could even go through and add another range node in here. And theoretically, with this range node, I should be able to really clamp down some of these values and give it, like really sort of hone in on a specific look I'm going for. You know, I can make that kind of overall less obvious. So one thing you can do, like if you fiddle with it a little bit and like really crunch down the values, you can get this sort of look where you have very spotty wear on the edges of your object, which I think looks really cool, honestly. I think this looks way more natural than whatever I had like 2 seconds ago. But you can really do a lot of crazy stuff. Like the more stuff you sort of attach together, you can really push this and get some really interesting stuff with the scratches. But you can see, so I mean, I already have like this one texture just for the scratches. I do have like a crap ton of a lot of nodes here. Ideally, I would be labeling these as I go, where it's like, oh, curvature for edge scratches or something like that, but I'm not going to. But eventually, if you do enough procedural texturing, you'll get like 50 nodes for a single shader, and then you get really sad when you haven't labeled anything, and you're like, oh god, I have like 10 curvature nodes, which one am I looking for? But anywho. So, any questions on doing like edge scratches? All right.
You want to have the video and stuff on the Blackboard, right?
Yep, it should be recording. If this one is for some reason not, which it is, I do have the ones from yesterday, and I think if you guys have been watching the videos and you notice the audio sucks, I think I fixed that. I had to like hack the settings on my computer, but hopefully there will now be real person audio on these. But yeah. So again, this might not show up well, but if I grab this and set it to concave, I'm just curious what effect that gives me. And actually, it did kind of put some like little scratches on the inside. So if I swap this out to be my rust texture, that could look like a little bit of grime or something on the inside of that. Which again, I didn't really set up my shaders for that, but whatever. So I'm just gonna go back and set that back to convex. All right, so that's pretty much edge scratches. The next thing I want to show you guys is how to add a layer of like rusty, grimy crud onto. This is actually gonna be hard to see later. So I'm gonna show you guys how to add some like grimy crud onto the bottom of your areas, or like, so if you've ever gone out and you've seen like rusty stuff or where there's like mud and stuff in things, and it gets into crevices, and those crevices aren't touched as much, so the mud just sort of sits there and collects forever. I'll show you guys how to do stuff like that. So again, you can totally just use a curvature node if you need like really fine layers of dust and little crevices. You can also use an ambient occlusion node to give you a little bit broader of an effect. So I'm just gonna clean out this, do mix, grab another mix shader. Apparently I have caps lock on. Mix shader. Waha. Mix rust. All right, I will throw that casually on my object. And I'm going to plug in my car paint and my rust. So, oh god, why does it have a noise texture? Oh, right, that's my rust. Yeah, my rust is just really ugly. It is a very bad rust texture.
Looks like you use that to make a marble coolness.
Oh yeah, you totally could. Yeah, you could probably procedurally texture the crap out of stuff and like make really nice marble textures if you just combined a bunch of different like default Maya nodes and like edited the crap out of them.
Right, because if you just pitch it white.
Yep.
Then
Yeah. No, it would be, yeah, this does look kind of metally. So one thing I might actually do really quick, because this rust texture just makes me sad. This is not a nice rust texture. So I have some rust textures stashed on my computer. So you guys can do, pretty much all the values I've been using are just like generic shader values. But you can use like actual file textures for your stuff. So if I wanted to go in, I could put in like real person textures for this rust that actually make it look kind of like rust instead of whatever the heck my gross little noise texture was. So I'll just like throw some of them in. It's just gonna make my rust look nicer. So for this week's assignment, if you want to go on like texture.com or something and like download some generic textures for your rust or whatever, I am more than fine with you guys doing that, as long as you do the procedural texturing stuff. You're also welcome to make your own textures. It really doesn't matter to me. All right, and I'll do a bump map, and then I'll be done. I think my bump map made this look really ridiculous last time, but I could be wrong. Height. All right. Rust. I think I actually forgot to do. All right, that looks kind of better. All right, so this rust texture looks way less crap than what I had before. So again, you can use your own real person textures, and if I look at my mix node now, I mean, now it just kind of looks awkward and lumpy, but so yeah, I'll show you how to actually add on the ambient occlusion shader to get the sort of rusty effect. Wow, oops, mix rust. Oh yeah. All right, so again, I'm just gonna hit tab and type in ambient occlusion. You'll see it pulls up AI ambient occlusion, pretty much the first thing. So I'm gonna grab that, and I'm just going to, I don't need to look at this right now, like this little surface node, so I'm just gonna hide that because it's irritating. But I'll grab that and grab the R value and throw it into my mix node. And you can see that immediately it's done kind of this weird thing where it's thrown, again, I always mix up my textures, but it's thrown the rust on top of the blue, which kind of makes a neat effect, but isn't quite what I'm going for. So really quick, I'm just going to, again, just go into my mix shader and swap out my values, and throw car paint on shader 2 and rust on shader 1. One day my brain will accept how these actually function, but today is not that day. If at first you don't succeed, plug in the maps to the opposite little channel thing. So I'm gonna look at my ambient occlusion node, and if any of you guys have had me before or like known about ambient occlusion stuff, I went over this a little bit I think last quarter. But basically what ambient occlusion does is it looks at your object and it says what values, like how far away is this geometry from other geometry around it. So you'll notice like up here on the top of the object it's really white because there's literally nothing above this in my scene. Whereas these little crevices down here or like in here, they tend towards darker because they are like closer to other geometry. So the closer it is, like in this little teeny, super tiny crevice I made here, the closer it is, the darker the ambient occlusion is, and the farther the object, or like if there's nothing there or it's like really far away from stuff, it's going to be brighter. But basically, again, this kind of allows you to, it's a different way to isolate areas that might collect grime in a little bit broader way. So you notice like the curvature node before, it would highlight really strongly like these little ridges in here, whereas this is more just sort of like, there's like crud all over the inside of this, just sort of generally. That's more or less the difference between the two. If you wanted to, you could actually combine them both with do a multiply node like we did before, but I'm just going to show you the ambient occlusion stuff. So there's again a few more samples down here, or a few more settings down here that you can play with. They're going to give you a little bit different effects. And I find these like very awkward and hard to control just in general for like the ambient occlusion, just like with these settings. So I'm going to throw in a range node in here so that I can actually control this a little bit better. So again, I'm just going to grab my out color, throw it into my input, and grab out color R from my range and put it into my mix. So now what I have a little bit more control. Usually I just start like crushing values down and then they get really ridiculous. All right, this looks gross. I find these to be the most, like they give good effects. They just are awkward in my opinion to tweak. Very awkward to tweak. All right, anywho. Never before have I had so much trouble with this. But anywho, so you can see, assuming that I might have found something that I don't completely despise in this, you can, oh, there we go. Now you're doing, oh, okay. When in doubt, update your render view. All right, cool. So if you're ever like changing a bunch of sliders, I'm like, I know that should have been doing something if it wasn't. Try just like clicking on a different material or like refreshing your renderer. Because it was just not updating the render for some reason with the changes I was making. But you can see that like now the sliders are actually doing things. with this, you can play with a bunch of different stuff. So you can see I've like really crushed the value down here. So now I have a very solid layer of rust here that kind of fades off towards the top. And I think the way it's fading is a little awkward. So I might try to, where is it? I might try to like crush that down even more. I don't know. I'm not going to spend like 20 bajillion years refining this. But like for your assignments, just like fiddle with the textures until you get something that you think looks reasonable. In this case, I'm going to say this is kind of not terrible. But that's basically the ambient occlusion node. So are there any questions on that? All right. The last thing I have to show you guys in Arnold is how to add like that layer of dust to the top. And it's not difficult per se. It just has like a little bit more, like a few more steps than the ones that we've just done. So I'm going to make another mix shader. If you guys aren't super tired of hearing me say mix shader by now. And I'm going to throw in my car paint. I'm going to try in 2. And I'm going to throw in my dust. And what we're going to look for this time is the utility node. The AI utility node. So I'm going to hit tab, type in utility, and you can see it pulled it up. This has a bunch of different features to it, but basically what you're going to want to look actually. And I'm gonna throw this on a surface shader really quick in the color so you can see what this is actually doing, because it's a little bit arbitrary. All right, so here's my surface shader. Here's my utility node, and right now it's not really doing anything because I haven't specified what it needs to do. So for dust, the settings that you want for shade mode, set that to flat. You can see that this basically just, if you worked with surface shaders before, it basically just doesn't take into account light and just renders whatever color is mapped into the object. And then for color mode, you're going to go in and select normal. And basically what this does is it takes the whole object and is just showing you the values and the directions of the normals based on the color. So if I've never explained how normal maps work before, this is, I guess, a fairly reasonable visual representation of one. So you'll notice that if you look on the top of my object, it's mostly green. Pretty much anywhere on like the top, facing upwards towards the positive Y is green, or greener. And if you look down here, so like that little, what's it called? That little like axis handle in the bottom left of your screens, that shows like the direction of the X, Y, and Z axis. So you'll notice like the Y axis is green, so anything pointing towards Y on my normals is green. X axis is red, so anything facing positive X axis is going to be like a red or pinky color. And then anything facing Z is going to be blue because that's how Maya denotes the colors of the axes. So basically it's what normals and normal maps are doing is they're using different values for RGB to kind of point to a general direction. So if you're going like positive Y, facing straight up, like perfectly straight up, is going to give you a value in the green channel of 255, and facing straight down towards negative Y is going to give you a green value of 0. And that's basically how normal maps kind of work. So if you guys have ever seen normal maps, and you're like, wow, why are these so weird and like purple colored and like trippy? That's pretty much what it's like, how it's working. It's just using those different color channels to calculate stuff. And you can see again that it's pretty much doing the same thing here, where anything towards the sort of like going towards the right is a little bit redder, top stuff is green, and then the other side is like bluer color. Does that make sense? Cool. That's a trippy normal map. Yes. All right. Stop it. That's pretty much normal map. So basically what we're going to be doing is clamping down the values of this green here to create the sort of mask for the rusty effect on the top of this object, or the dust effect. So to do that, you're going to need, I don't need this, well, I can use this surface shader. So I'm going to throw in another multiply node, the AI multiply node. And I'm going to put the out color of my utility into input 1, and I'll throw my out color of the multiply into my surface shader so I can see what I'm doing. So I'm actually going to, I'm not going to map in like a file texture or like a node into input 2. I'm just going to turn that green. And I want that to be perfectly green. So if you guys ever have any doubt, this should give you perfect values of green, but you can double check that if you just switch to RGB mode. Red, blue, you want a value of 0, and green, you want a value of 265. Alternately, if it looks fluorescent green, it's probably doing what you want. And you can see that that's like really punched down the values and really made only the green stuff show up. So again, I'm just looking at this in my surface shader. And then if you wanted to, so you notice like the areas of most green are at the top, where it's like the greeniest green, and then anywhere that's facing down tends to be a little bit more black or darker. And again, that's just how the normals work. So I'm going to add in another range node into here. And out color of multiply into range, because I do not want dust covering like the entire undersurface of my object. It looks ridiculous. So I'm just going to, again, sort of like twiddle with this. And meh. That actually may have worked the first time. Let's find out. All right, so right now I'm looking at out color of this range just in my surface shader. And I'm actually about ready to connect this into my mix. So I threw my mix onto the object again. So before I've just been randomly grabbing the out color R. Since this one is dependent on normals and like the green, like the color, that's how it's getting its data. I do need to specifically grab the green channel. So once I throw that into my mix, I did it wrong again. Every time. I second guess myself and then I'm just like, great. But anyway, so you can see now that it's, it has this sort of dusty effect on the top. And you can just keep going back and forth and sort of playing with your range slider until you get something that you like. If you push it like too far, it'll reverse your values and give you this crazy pinky stuff. But anywho, that's more or less how you add dust onto the top of stuff. So are there any questions about this? Like how I did any of this? All right. If you for some reason need to, I don't know, mimic a sandstorm or something weird, you can actually take like the R value. So you'll notice right now if I put the R value in, the out color R, into the mix, it's doing nothing because I basically turned everything green, so there's no red values for it to do anything with, and it's just like, it's just black. Enjoy your car paint. So if I can actually switch this down, I'll leave the utility node how it is, and just set the multiply. If I grab like red instead of green here, now you'll notice that my the range is crushing down those red values, and if I look at my dust, it's pretty much splattered one side of it with dust. So again, maybe it would be useful if you need to recreate like a sandstorm effect. But that's more or less how you add dust. Just remember, like this one is actually color dependent. So just like be aware of which colors you're attaching in. Very awkward little dust. But yeah, so any questions on that? All right. Any questions on anything we've gone over for procedural texturing? Because I'm about to show you guys how to link this all into one giant texture of terror. All right. Cool. So, like I showed you guys my shader ball earlier, and this is like clearly, you know, has all this stuff combined. Basically, to do that, you just need to make an unholy chain of mix nodes that are all attached to each other, which is, again, easier in Redshift because they set up their shaders a little bit nicer. But, yeah. So, once this is done, it's going to end up being more or less like a pyramid of stuff. So, my goal is to have a single mix node that this object can be assigned to. And that mix node, again, is just going to have a chain of other mix nodes attached into it. Basically all funneling down into the one mix node that's assigned to the actual material. And the order that you do this in is actually important. Similarly to, you know, how your layers in Photoshop are important, like the order of them. Same thing with the mix node. So whatever is closer to that final shader that you're assigning is going to render first. Whatever is farther back in the chain is going to render, whatever's farther back in the chain is going to be basically covered up by the stuff that is closer to that final shader. So whatever that final shader is going to apply everything over top of everything else. So in this case, it probably makes sense to go in and throw like dust on top of everything. So I'm going to leave that as the shader that is attached to my ball. And I am going to put that back in my, where am I going? Rust. God, I didn't label it, did I? What have I done? Mix dust. Where do I even have that selected? Oh, duh. All right, so here I have my mix shader for my dust. And basically what I'm going to do for this, so I want dust over scratches in my paint. So looking down here, I have my my shader 1 for my car paint. Instead of this being plain car paint, I'm just going to attach in my mix node with the scratches in it. So here I have my scratches. So I'm just going to throw that in and replace it with car paint. Oh right, I forgot I left this one with blue metal in it. All right. Cool. So now you can see I have my really ugly layer of dust over my very questionable scratches in this paint. And you might also notice, so I had 2 versions of the scratch texture. One was just the edge scratches, and one was like the texture scratches. So I do want both of these to show up in my final. So what I'm going to do is basically just attach in, and it doesn't really matter which order you do this into. It's the same basic principle. It's just going to apply this chrome texture over everything else that's behind it. So here, instead of having car paint, I'm going to throw in my texture scratches. So you can see that it is sort of mixing together my edge scratches and my side scratches. It might be a little bit hard to see because I bumped down the contrast on that kind of a lot. But you'll notice, like, again, here's just the texture, and then here's with those like little edge scratches thrown in there. So now if I look at my dust, I can see both of them on top of each other. And then pretty much I'm just going to do the same thing for the rust. So I'm kind of imagining that like it was maybe rusty and then there was some scratches taken out of it. So I'm just going to grab my rust and replace the car paint on this. So now I have basically scratched up, rusty, gross, dusty effects on my material. Does this make sense? Cool. So again, I mean, this looks pretty simple just because of the way I was like adding everything into each other. I'm going to just go ahead and expand the inputs and outputs of this. And this is the whole shader tree for that one material. Which, I mean, again, you can see there's like a crap ton of a lot of stuff piped into this. Which is why I would very much recommend, like, as you go, label things clearly. Because I have like 4 base textures that are just like 4 random surface shaders and 4 mix nodes that are all being used to create this one final texture. So again, if you don't label this stuff, you're going to confuse the crap out of yourself if they're all just labeled AI Standard Surface 1. But that's more or less procedural texturing. That should be pretty much like I think what you need to get yourselves through this week. So are there any questions about the Arnold stuff before I wander over into the redshifts? Actually, I do want to show you one more quick thing, but it'll take like 5 seconds. All right. So really quick, I'm just going to... So I said that the procedural texturing is great because it applies to pretty much whatever object, which is totally the case. So here I just have my weird low poly head that I throw into every scene like a crazy person. So it's become my weird, fun, just like object to use for things. So I'm going to take this and just assign it my mixed dust. And when I render this, it explodes. Mixed dust, what are you doing? All right. What? Okay, that's stupid. But you can see it's pretty much gone through and, you know, thrown the same texture onto my object. It's just putting the dust in different places. It's like has it on the top of the head, the sides of the shoulders, all that stuff. So if you ever do need to switch between like really similar textures for stuff, again, this is a great way to do it. And you can make minimal modifications to this to get pretty different effects. Which, me being the person I am who hates Photoshop and texture mapping, I do loves me some procedural texturing. There are a bunch of other nodes that exist. Maya has a lot of nodes that can be used, just like default Maya nodes, that can be used to do other effects, but that stuff I'll go over next week once you guys have sort of like fiddled with this and kind of, I guess, got your heads around how to do this and like how to manage giant node trees of terror. So, yeah. All right. So, final call for questions in Arnold. All right. If that is the case, I'm going to